Hi everyone. So I am back again after a very long time with a chapter called Errors and Exceptions in Python. So what are we exactly going to be learning in this particular chapter? Firstly, we will definitely learn what exactly is an error. What do you understand by the term error? The different types of errors. Then what is an exception? How do you handle these exceptions and what are the various built-in exceptions? So these are the topics that we plan to do in this particular video. So what is an error? So all of you all must have written so many programs. You must have come across some errors. They are they're categorized into different types. So basically, what's an error? Any issue in the program which probably, could prevent the program from executing correctly. When I say executing correctly, it could stop the execution completely, like crash the program, or it could give you a result which is undesired. All these cases, we say the program has an error. So in Python, or in fact in any programming language, there are these three categories of errors. We have something called the syntax error, something called the runtime error, and something called the logical error. Now, what's a syntax error? Every programming language has certain rules that you need to follow. Now, what do I mean by rules? In Python, you know that if you're starting a compound statement like a if or a for, it should, that statement should end with a colon and all the lines indented under it. So this is the rule of the language. If we don't follow this rule, we are actually going to get a syntax error. Now, let me remind you that syntax errors, we don't have to wait to execute the program to see a syntax error. When we type the program itself, you must have seen you get a bubble there, which tells you that you have an error, right? Okay. Coming to runtime errors, these are errors that occur during the execution of the program. That means while we are typing the program, we are not aware that we could be having an error. It's while we are executing the program we get an error. For example, if you're going to read the values of a and b from the user and then divide the value of a with b, and what if the user enters a 0? Now he's going to be entering that only during execution. So these errors are called runtime errors. Runtime errors are actually what is exceptions. We'll deal with a little later. Coming to logical errors. Logical errors are errors created by the programmer. The computer will never be able to locate a logical error. Then how will you find a logical error? When you execute the program, you know that you need to be getting your answer as 15. But when you look at the program, you realize that the answer that you've got is 25, which means code that I have written is not logically correct. It's incorrect. So I need to be correcting the code or putting the logic right or putting the formula right. So these errors won't be detected by Python. It is the programmer's duty to detect such errors. So these are the three types of errors, which is syntax errors, runtime errors, and logical errors. Okay. Now, what's a syntax error? I've just given you a small example there. If you see, I've written print hello, and you would have clearly noticed I've written hello with an opening double quotes, but I have not terminated with a double quotes at the end. So this is a syntax error. Now, do I have to run the program to see the error? No. While I've typed that line and when I move to the next line, the interpreter automatically shows me, a error symbol next to that line telling me that's an error. But let's say I ignored that and I executed the program. If I executed the program, I would get such a statement there, and this word syntax error would be displayed because it is a syntax error. You have not followed the rules of the language. Clear? Okay. Look at another example. I wrote if age greater than 18, you see there's a colon missing there. Okay. So if I execute this program, I will get an error message saying syntax error expected colon. And can you see a small arrow next to 18, which is telling me that's where the colon was expected. So if you violate the rules of a programming language, you are going to come across a syntax error. Clear? Okay, coming to runtime error. I've written a statement there, print hello plus 2. Now I know hello is a string, 2 is an integer. So you cannot be using this plus operator to, between a string and an integer. You could have had both integers, not a problem. You could have had both strings, it would work as concatenation. But in this scenario, I have used the wrong data types for that operator. So this becomes a runtime error, and I see this only while I execute the program. And I get an error like this. Now, in runtime errors, mind you, you don't get the word runtime error. It actually tells you what kind of an error it is. In this scenario, it's called the type error. Now, what's a type error? What are the other errors? You will surely see soon. I wrote a statement like this, input, enter a number. Correct? So statement looks fine. When I executed the program, when I asked the user enter a number, instead of entering a number, he wrote ABC. So obviously my program is going to crash and I'll get a value error with that message there, right? So these are runtime errors, errors that occur during the execution of the program only. Oh, another category of errors was logical error. I told you it's because we have understood the question law wrong. We have applied the wrong formula. We have written a wrong logic to acquire the result. Okay. So I had to calculate the perimeter, let's say, of a rectangle. And I wrote P is equal to 2 into, I should have written L and L plus B in bracket, but I did not. Does that mean computer says it's an error? No. When I run the program, the answer, it says perimeter 25. But I know it is 10 plus 5, which is 15, and 15 multiplied by 2 should have given me a 30. So I get a undesired result. And that's when I know that I have made a logical error. Okay. So now what are the built-in exceptions? Now, what are exceptions? Basically errors. But basically this term exception is used with runtime errors. So what are the various built-in exceptions that we see? We are mentioning a few here. There are many more. The first one being value error. When will you come across the term value error? You have the correct data type, but the wrong value associated with it. We just saw a value error when the user said enter a number. When the programmer said enter a number, the user entered ABC. And if you look at the statement that we wrote in Python for this, we wrote int input. So input is supposed to read a string and int is supposed to convert the string into an integer. So ABC was a string, so that was fine. It was a correct data type. Int was supposed to convert the string into a integer. What happens in that scenario is I cannot convert ABC into an integer. So the data type of ABC required for that function was correct, but the value was wrong. I had to enter a number which would be taken as a string, which would then be converted to an integer. So that's when you get the value error. That means the value that you're using is not right or not valid. The data type is correct. Another example, let's say you are calling the sqrt function of math. Okay, so sqrt function needs a number file. So instead of writing math.sqrt in bracket 25, I write math.sqrt in bracket minus 25. So if you're looking at the data type, it's an integer and it's fine. But we know we can't find square roots of a negative number, right? I mean, regular square roots. Otherwise, it would be an imaginary number. So that's what I mean by data type right, but value is wrong. Okay. The next kind of error is called the type error. Whenever we perform an operation on wrong data type, in the previous example, we saw we tried to use a plus operator with a string and an integer. So the plus operator required either both strings or the plus operator required both integers, and it would have worked fine. But when the data type used for a particular function or an operation is wrong, then you get a type error. Coming to name error. Let's say I make a call to a function called fun, but there is no function called fun existing in the code. Okay, probably the function's name is func, but I called a function called fun. So when you refer to a variable or a function that's not defined, let's say I give another example. Let's say I say print a. My program doesn't have a variable called a. So I'm referring to a variable that is not defined. In that scenario, I get a name error. Then you have something called the index error. You must have got this index out of range. You have a list with 4 values. So obviously the index numbers are going to be 0 to 3. But let's say you try to access the elements of the list using index number 7. So obviously 7 doesn't exist in the list, so it's out of range. So what kind of an error do we get, or an exception do we get? We get something called the index error. Same thing is the case with a dictionary. We access elements of a dictionary using a key. Suppose I have a dictionary with keys A, B, and C, and I'm trying to access the elements of the dictionary using a key called D, which doesn't exist. So what kind of an error do we get? We get something called a key error. Zero division error. I just told you, if you try dividing a number by 0, I would get an error, and that kind of an error is called the zero division error. And the last one that we're going to talk about is something called EOF. EOF is an error. Actually, this is useful for us. You will see it in the chapter called files. EOF error occurs when we reach the end of the file. Say I open a file and I'm going on reading contents from the file. At some point of time, I will reach the end of file where I can't read anything more. In such situations, if I try to read anything beyond the end of the file, I try to get, or I will be getting a EOF error. So these are few built-in exceptions that are there. So then what is exception handling? Now, when we get these errors, what normally happens? Our system crashes, right? Our system stops working wherever that error is. So what is exception handling? Techniques to handle these runtime errors so that the system doesn't crash. Probably you could, and makes it a little more user friendly, which means, let's say by mistake, when you said enter a number, the person entered a string. Instead of the system crashing, you could just tell him, okay, sorry, you've entered a string, please enter a number. Give him an opportunity to enter the number once again, making it a user friendly program. So that's what I mean by exception handling. Foreseeing that there could be these kind of errors, and if these kind of errors occur, I need to write some code. I need to write some code which will be able to handle such exceptions. And that's what I call exception handling. And what's the code for exception handling? For exception handling, we basically use the try except block. Between the try and the except, you write the code which you think could have an exception or an error. After the except block, you write the code that you want to execute if there is an exception while running the code. The else and the finally are optional parameters. When you write else, whatever you write after else is going to be executed when you have no exceptions. And when you write finally, you are going to execute the code after finally, whether there was an exception or there wasn't an exception. So basically, try except. Only these two are enough. Handle exceptions, but this try except block also has keywords else and finally. So I repeat, write the code that you think could have an error after the try block, after the try statement, or I say in the try block. Write the code that is written to handle the exception after the except or in the except block. Whatever you write in the else block will be executed only if while running this program, no exception or error occurred. Whatever you write in the finally block always gets executed whether you had an exception or you didn't have an exception. Clear? Okay. Let's just look at some examples. Now, I wrote an example here. I wrote age is equal to int input. Please enter your age. And I wrote a print statement saying that, oh, I see that you are these many years old. And I wrote except value error. Now, value error would mean what? What would value error mean? If I run the program, now let's say I executed the program and the user entered his code, I mean, age as 23. Now, there's no issue with this statement. Therefore, the line of the except block was not executed because no exception occurred. And it said, I see that you are 23 years old. But if I wrote, please enter your age, okay, you entered, you're supposed to enter a number as a string, which will be converted to an integer, but you entered ABC. What happens? You are trying to say here that ABC has to get converted to an int. Basically, what are you trying to do here? You are basically trying to do int in double quotes ABC, which means you're trying to convert ABC to an integer. So int is supposed to convert a string to an integer. Data type, correct. The value for conversion is not correct. So therefore, a value error exception occurs. So what exactly happens? Because you got a value error, whatever you wrote here gets executed and you get a message there saying, hey, that wasn't a number. Okay. Now, in the mechanism, I just told you try and accept, but I wrote try, accept, and a value error. That means this line will not be executed if there's any other exception occurring. Only if it's a value error that is occurring, you will get this message. Okay. Let's look at another example. Okay. I'm asking the user to enter a dividend. I'm asking the user to enter a divisor, and then I'm actually performing a division operation. Now I just wrote except, right? So I didn't mention what kind of exception I'm looking for. So except block will be executed irrespective of what kind of exception occurs. In this scenario, let's talk about two exceptions that could occur. The user could enter the divisor as 0. So you could have a zero division error, or the user could enter a non-numeric value. Then in that case, you're having a value error. So whether you have a value error or whether you have a division by zero error or any other error or exception, the message you will get is, oops, something went wrong. So it will execute, oops, something went wrong for any kind of exception that would or that could appear when you execute this code. For example, it said, please enter the dividend. I entered 12 and that line was fine. It tried the next line, please enter the divisor. I entered 0. The issue is not here. Huh? Issue is when it actually went to do the next line, dividend divided by divisor. So when it went to do 12 divided by 0, the exception called zero division exception occurs. But I have written a exception handling mechanism here. So it goes to my except block and gives me, oops, something went wrong. Something went wrong. What is wrong? Not mentioned clearly. If instead of the divisor 0, I entered A, or even if I wrote the dividend as A, again, here it's the value error, but it still gives me the same message saying, oops, something went wrong. Okay, so you could just write except, or you could mention except and what kind of a exception are you planning to handle. Okay, I gave you another example here. There I just wrote except. Here I wrote same question. Okay, I wrote except exception as E. I want you to understand this term here. What exactly does this mean? Whenever an exception occurs, definitely come to the except block. Okay, but whatever is the exception that occurred, the statement, not the type of exception, the message, whatever is the exception, it's going to trap it and store it in this variable that you wrote as E. So it says, try this block. If you come across an exception, you trap what is the exception, store it in E, and in the next line, I wrote print E. So apart from telling me, oops, something went wrong, it will actually tell me what went wrong. For example, if I wrote this, please enter the dividend 12, enter the divisor 0. So now that's where the division by 0 error is going to occur or exception is going to occur. So because that exception occurred, it went to the except block and it said something went wrong. And then because I said print E, this line got printed. Otherwise, this line wouldn't get printed because I have trapped the error. That means an error or the error statement, what Python would naturally give when the system crashes. That statement is trapped and stored in this variable called E, which I displayed in the except block. So I got what the error had to be. Okay, so this is, so previous was just writing except. You would get a message saying oops, but you wouldn't know what could be the error. Here, I have written the except alone. I have not mentioned what kind of exception I'm looking for. Any exception, trap it in E and show it to me. So instead of writing 0, if I would have written ABC, then it would give me the message that would tell me that you're not be using the correct value for int function. Okay. You could have multiple except statements also with a try. Now look at this question. We're doing the same question over and over again, so you understand what's happening. I have a try, so run this code. If it has an error, if it has a value error, you go to that except value error block, display that statement. If it has a zero division error, you go to the print statement and you display that block, that statement. If it has any other error, you didn't write just except, so that your program would crash. You could have just written except and said, sorry, something went wrong. Okay, so because you are only tackling or you're only handling value error and zero division error, system won't crash or program won't, not system crashing, program crash. Any other error occurring, obviously program will crash. So if I run the program and if I entered 0, okay, it didn't go to value error. It went to zero division error and showed me the message. The divisor cannot be 0. But instead of 0, I entered a string. Then it doesn't go to zero division error. Which exception occurred? Value exception occurred. So obviously it goes to the except value error block and displays the lines written in that block. I hope you're getting an idea of the try and accept. In a real-time scenario, what I would be doing is, if there is such an error, I would probably put this in a loop and ask the user to re-enter things. Okay. So that was about the whole chapter about how it works. Now I am just showing you a small example of a question that was asked in one of the board papers. Okay, now let's try to understand what exactly is happening. It's telling me, try this line. So word is a string, right? Word is a string. N here, if you see, is also a string. Fine. So plus operator can be applied with two strings. So what message will I get? I will just be doing concatenation and my output would be word 5 followed by a hash, right? Okay. I would not go to the except block because the try statement was done without any error. But I definitely go to else because else says when there is no exception, execute the statement in else. So I go to the else block and it gives me the answer done. Okay. After that, finally is a block, whether you get exception or don't get exceptions, you will do that. So you get a done with a hash because of the end is equal to hash. And then I have the statement saying, oh. So this would be the output of this particular thing. But let's say this was not written as string 5, but just as 5. Then what would happen? It would try to do this. So there I'm trying to use a plus operator with a string and an integer, which definitely is going to give me a type error. Okay, because the data type for the operation is not matching. So where will I go? I will go to the message called error. So in that scenario, my message will be error with the hash. Okay. Am I allowed to go to else? No, you go to else only if no exception would have appeared, or there was no exception happened. In our case, exception happened. So I don't get to go to the else part, but definitely, finally is going to be done whether you are going to be having an exception or not having an exception. Is that clear? So I hope you understood the various types of exceptions. From the exam point of view, they could give you small output questions asking you what kind of exception is going to be created. So remember all the 7 exceptions that we learned. That was the value error, the key error, the index error, the type error, the name error, the zero division error, and the EOF error. Okay, so EOF error you will see when you will be doing the files chapter. So I hope the concept of exception handling is clear. Okay, it's a very small thing. So I hope the concept of the exception handling is clear. Thank you. And if you think you like the video, please don't forget to share with your friends and subscribe. Thank you.